Small hand-toss EDFs that incorporate a 50mm fan aren't anything new. They're all the rage today, in fact, and we've seen 50mm F-18s before, but I promise you, haven't seen one quite like this. What's up everybody, I'm Adam, you're watching Model Aviator, and we have another new release from HobbyKing this week. You read the title, so you're going to know part of what HobbyKing did with this airplane, but they actually did much more. Now some of you are going to recognize this mold. This is not the first 50mm F-18 to be put out, and it's not the first one to incorporate this particular mold. Obviously, the new coat of paint is awesome. It looks so good. It depicts an airplane from VMFX 246, which is actually a Marine experimental squadron that tests weapons systems, targeting systems, radar systems, things like that. And they basically approve it, make sure that it works good and it's functional the way they want it to before that stuff is incorporated by actual fleet fighter squadrons. So that's pretty cool. It's not a paint scheme or a squadron that I've seen depicted before. I even had to ask my buddy John what the heck the X meant. I'm familiar with the V, M, and F. That's Fixed Wing Marine Fighter Squadron. But I've seen an A, which is Fighter and Attack Squadron. Never seen an X. I think that's pretty cool. Obviously, it's 4S. Finally, HobbyKing did some testing and figured out a way to use a 1000 to 1200 milliamp 4S pack. They got the right KV motor, the right fan, and the right ESC combination, so it's rated for 4S. Finally, a 50mm EDF that's rated for 4S. Everything else out there is 3S. The other versions of this mold that you've seen are 3S, and frankly, people run 4S in a lot of these 50mm EDFs. Some get away with it, some burn things up. Others go to the trouble to cut and move things around, take the ESC out, put a bigger ESC in so they can feel good about running 4S. Finally, somebody has decided, HobbyKing has done what we all wanted companies to do in the first place with this series and genre of hand tosser EDF, and that is just make them 4S right out of the gate. So man, I'm glad to see that. The other thing that they did, they reinforced the airframe a bit on the tail section. This mold doesn't come with a spar for the horizontals, so HobbyKing figured out a pretty creative way to reinforce that to handle the extra speed and flight loads of this airplane on 4S. And it is much faster and much more aggressive than any version of this that you've ever seen. You'll see that in the flight footage. And the other thing they did is something that a lot of companies do, but nobody's ever done with a 50mm F-18, and that is they incorporated a gyro. And it is the best kind of gyro as far as features. You have an off switch, which I love. I love having stabilization, self-leveling, and off. That way, whatever kind of pilot you are, whatever you prefer, you've got your choice, and I really dig that. We'll get into, I kind of stuck my nose into this gyro much more than I normally do. Usually, you know, I'll test them for a couple of minutes, decide I don't care for them, and then turn them off and just set the airframe up. Well, I did that, but then I went back to the gyro and did a little bit more. We'll get into that. But before I get ahead of myself, let's start right from the beginning. So the assembly, and we'll get into that right off the bat. If you notice, there's a little blemish here. The airplane came in perfect condition, packed really, really well with no damage. That's actually a repair by yours truly and Miss Heidi, because we had a little hand launch incident. But yeah, it was perfect before we dorked it and then had to fix it. So that's why that doesn't look perfect. Yours, you know, will. So when it comes to the assembly, it's pretty easy. There is glue involved, obviously. The wings have one single plug for the ailerons, a carbon spar, and you glue the wings on. The two verticals are glued on. They're non-functional, doesn't have rudders. The two horizontals are glued on, and you have to glue on the little reinforcing plates. Now, something that I want to suggest to you is when you line those reinforcing plates up, make sure that you tweak those horizontals and make sure that they line up with the wing. I got one of them a little bit wrong, and that caused me kind of a problem in the flying that we'll talk about a little bit later. I was able to get it straightened up, but it will be much easier if you just make sure that's straight when you assemble yours. So when you're putting those reinforcing plates on, make sure you get everything lined up before you glue it and batten it down. Then you have to hook up your push rods. They're easy to adjust, not a big deal. You put your receiver in and that is it. And speaking of receiver, you're going to see here, this is the battery bay. To get our receiver out of the way so that we can put our battery all the way back, which is not where we ended up using it. We'll talk about that when we talk about the flying and the setup. But you can tuck your receiver, as you can see here, right inside the fuselage, right behind the gyro, and that is just a pretty awesome place to put it to make more room in the battery bay. And that is pretty much the assembly. When it comes to setting up the F-18, we didn't have instructions. You will. I'm sure there'll be a balance and some throw suggestions. Expo is obviously variable. Try whatever the manual says out first. I'm sure that will be a very good suggestion. They've really done their homework on this airplane. We had to kind of figure it out for ourselves, so I did a lot of experimenting, and for what it's worth, we're going to put our setup page up so that you can see what we did and compare it to whatever your instructions will tell you to do, and you can just kind of go from there and figure out what's best for you. One of the things I definitely want to point out, as I said before when we talked about putting this airplane together, make sure you get the horizontals straight. If you don't, you have one off, that's going to change the way that the elevators come up together. Since they each have their own servo, what you don't want is to have one going up further than the other as you pull back on your gimbal for up elevator or down. So once I got my tail straight, I made sure that both elevators were neutralized, and part of doing that too, something you may want to check, it could be that this was a little bit of a pre-production model or something like that. But one of my servos, the left servo, the servo arm wasn't lined up in the same place as it was on the other side. So you want to make sure that those servo arms are essentially in the same place. I had one that was just a tooth off, and I had to change it a tooth to get those arms to be essentially parallel to each other across. If you start with that, then you're going to have push rods that are the same length, and that will make the elevators go up at the same rate. That's really important. So just double check that, make sure that that's right. We'll give you our setup on our setup page here before the flying. We did something a little bit creative. We did tinker with the gyro, something that I noticed with this gyro just from feel. Obviously there is some degree of expo set in this gyro. So what was happening is the amount of expo that we had set in manual mode when we would flip into stabilization, and when I say manual mode I mean gyro off. When we would flip into stabilization, the airplane would feel a bit flat. Felt like it wasn't reacting the same way, almost as if the gyro was fighting me. It's not that that's what was happening. What was happening is essentially the expo that I had in the airplane that is perfect in manual mode just adds to the expo that is programmed into the stabilization in stabilization mode. So essentially I had too much expo. So to fix that, what we did in our transmitter is just put our rates on the same switch as our gyro. So when I'm in manual mode, I have a specific amount of throw and a specific amount of expo. When I flip it into stabilization mode, the throw doesn't change, but the expo does. There's much less expo. I did fly the airplane with no expo in stabilization mode. That felt a little too sensitive to suit me, so I did add some expo, but nowhere near as much as it needs in manual mode with no stabilization. So it's just an idea that you might want to use for yourself, so that when you flip it in the different modes on the gyro, it changes the expo so that the airplane flies the same whether you're in manual with no stabilization or using the gyro in stabilization. So just something to think about. So yeah, with that, you'll see our balance point. Our balance point is probably going to be forward of what the manual says. Possibly, I don't really know what it's going to say, what it will suggest, but you see how the airplane flies. We like it there. You'll see our balance point for what it's worth. Our 1000 milliamp batteries are pretty much smack dab in the center of the tray. And we flew the airplane with them as far back as we could get them and as far forward as we could get them. Happy medium between those two is where we like the plane. So there's that for what it's worth. So yeah, check out this flying footage and we'll see you back here and sum it up. The self-leveling mode on the gyro makes launching really easy. We got very consistent launches when we used it. The Hornet's pretty stable all through the envelope, and there's definitely a lot of power on tap when you want it. With the 4S power system, this thing accelerates really fast. You go from cruising to hauling in a big hurry. The Hornet has a lot of rotational torque. You'll see a little bit of it here. It's a light plane, and that motor and fan combination is making a lot of power. After this landing, we've got some bonus footage coming, and the first thing you'll see in the bonus footage is a really good demo of all the rotational torque this airplane has when you get slow, but you're still under power. Check this out. This is interesting. A lot of power on a limb, and as the plane comes to a stop, it's still under power. Look at this. A full roll, and that was all rotational torque. Doing a little bit of inverted here for you, and on this particular flight the wind had picked up to between 5 and 7 miles an hour. This is with the gyro active in stabilization, and you can see airplane still tracks pretty true. F-18 moves on out, and as you can see, it has got some impressive vertical. Pretty rock solid, even with an aggressive hard pull. Can't remember if that was gyro on or off, but it behaves pretty much the same way either way. It grooves nicely when it's set up right. It's a really good flying airplane. And there we go. If it looked like I was having fun, I was. I like this little airplane. Fun to fly. It was a neat process, kind of figuring out how to get it set up. Obviously, as we said before, it'll be easier for you. You'll have some information. Yeah, I like it. I really do. If I had to nitpick something, could I nitpick something and find a negative? Yeah, the gray is hard to see on a cloudy day, and it's really fast, gets out there. My old eyes, you know, a brighter color would be better, but then it would look like an F-18. They're painted this color for a reason. So it's not really a fair critique, but I guess if you just wanted to critique it, you could say that if you wanted to. I like for anything that I fly to have a rudder, and I wish every hand tosser that anybody ever made had them, but I understand why this one doesn't. We've seen some end users with some other 50mm EDFs add a rudder servo farther forward and run a light push rod back to their single rudder, but this one has two. There's no way to deal with that up here where it wouldn't be unsightly. There's no place to put a servo and run two push rods from one servo. The only way to do it would be two servos, one in each vertical, and if you put that much weight back there on this airframe, it's not going to work good. It's going to add a lot of weight. You're going to have to add a lot of weight to the nose to make up for that, to make the thing overall heavy. You don't want to do that. So I get why this one doesn't have it. Makes sense. Does fine as a bank and yank anyway. Again, I had a great time with it. I love, love, love that it's 4S. It's about time somebody did that with a 50mm EDF. Kudos to HobbyKing for doing just that. Thank you. Yeah, it's not that hard to build. You just got to build it straight. Not that hard to set up, and again, you'll have information, so it'll be even easier for you. It's not that hard to fly, although it's not a beginner airplane. Would it be a good first EDF? Probably, depending on the individual. I think if you are an intermediate skill pilot and you have some aerobatic airplane experience, then you'll have no trouble flying this. You might want to get somebody to help you hand launch it at first. But other than that, makes sense as a first EDF. It's not a huge expense. Better to make whatever mistakes you're going to make learning how to fly jets with something like this than to do it on something that costs $500 or $600. So probably not a bad idea, really. We're going to put a link in the description where you can get one of these at HobbyKing, just to kind of make it easy for you to get to it. I'm a fan. I think you will be too. Check it out. We appreciate you stopping by and watching this video. We enjoyed making it for you. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and we will see you next week with something else cool with wings. I think I'm going to go fly a Hornet.